Thanks for joining us today on the BIB Daily podcast. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief of Business in Vancouver. It seems the focus of the recovery of our economy is much like the politics in this country, focused very much on cities. The rural economy, that of our farms, of our rural communities that are the backbone of the country, really aren't getting the attention that the cities are getting at the moment. A recovery plan has been proposed by a consortium food producers in our country. Karen Ross is my guest. She's the head of the Farmers for Climate Solutions. She's in Montreal today as we speak. Good to see you.
Good morning, Kirk.
How's the farm going?
Let me just start off by saying that the pandemic has hit every sector in Canada, and farming and food is no exception.
Yeah.
This season has been hard and it's really been unprecedented. So, maybe just to mention a few things, like COVID-19 and the pandemic itself has impacted supply chains. If you think of farmers who provide to restaurants, all of a sudden restaurants are closed the next day and you're quickly scrambling to find new markets to sell your goods. We think about labor problems, issues with temporary foreign workers getting into the country. And then when they are here, the concerns around quarantine and how to continue to maintain farm work and get the harvests and production that you need while keeping everybody safe and healthy.
Yeah.
But 2020, Kirk, it wasn't just about COVID-19. We saw climate impacts as well across farms in Canada. So, I'm based in Quebec, and we saw this summer, on top of the pandemic, the worst drought and heat wave we've ever seen in the history of the province. But if I think back to last year, we dubbed this the hashtag harvest from hell because it was just far too wet. So these are the kinds of climate impacts that we're seeing across Canada, and it's really that unpredictability and kind of the more severe weather events that we're seeing that farmers are facing to kind of adapt and build their resilience.
Yeah, I want to focus on climate here in a moment, but I don't want to let go too much just these more immediate issues that have struck the sector, because I think a lot of Canadians would say, well, listen, we're all eating, we're still eating, so there must be thing. But what I think most don't understand is that the food sector is almost broken into two pieces. There's this piece that feeds all of us in our houses every day, but then there's this whole institutional restaurant, hotel type of food chain here, literally, that serves that. And that was what was really ruptured almost instantly when the pandemic broke out.
Yep, that's right. Farmers had to adapt very quickly, particularly farmers who are growing fruits and vegetables, mushrooms, potatoes for fast food rrestaurants. French fries were no longer a thing for a while when fast food restaurants shut down, which hit places like PEI quite hard. Every farmer was forced to cut production by about 30%. And that change, this is the way farmers make their livelihoods. So, many Canadians can't think about, today making 100% of your income and tomorrow going into your workplace only making 70.
Yeah.
That's what those changes in supply chains meant for farmers. But I just want to add to that, you mentioned that maybe regular Canadians still noticed that supermarket shelves were full. Just want to provide one example, and there were many others across Canada. Folks out in BC, where you guys are, actually noticed that blueberries were no longer available, and that's because many of the blueberry farms were less available. They'd fly off the shelves because there wasn't such a big supply, and that wasn't because blueberries weren't being produced, but rather it was challenging to get the labor on the land to be able to harvest the blueberries and get them to consumers.
Yeah. And what are we still struggling with? Are we still struggling with this labor shortage at the moment, Karen?
Well, let me just point to maybe a longer term crisis in the ag sector. So tens of thousands of jobs every year go unfilled in agriculture. And that's just one part of kind of the labor concerns in agriculture. So currently, yes, there's still a labor shortage, and it's different across provinces in the country. But if we're thinking kind of more long term, that's not the only labor issue in agriculture. The average age of a farmer in Canada is 55 years old.
Yeah,
so in the next 10 years, we may see kind of a mass retirement in the ag sector. And we need to think a lot about succession, which means, who's the new generation that's going to be taking up our farm fields. And for us, that generation, or and whether or not they're young, just new aspiring farmers are the folks who have grown up in a climate changing world, and many of them are going into farming because they want to they're motivated by environmental reasons as well.
Well,
So
I
yeah, go
wonder
ahead.
though whether those environmental reasons are also serving to disparage, to disparage the idea, to that it instills a little bit of apprehension about going into, basically learning something as intricate as farming, when you know that you might be facing changes every 3, 4, 5 years in terms of the crops that you can successfully yield.
That's exactly it, Kirk. I mean, farming is absolutely one of the most challenging professions. I think any business owner, you guys know this well, they're entrepreneurial, they're innovative, they're resilient, they're adaptable. But farmers, on top of just being entrepreneurs, have to deal with changing weather every year, which gets harder and harder with climate change. So, you know what? One of the things that we're really thinking about, and one of the things that we hope the government will support to scale up, is farmer to farmer mentorship programs, because
Hmm.
we see that as essential. Some of our members lead farmer mentorship programs in Canada, and what we see is astounding results for the new or the younger farmers who are mentored by farmers, as in their revenues grow much more quickly, their amount of production grow much more quickly, because they're able to kind of take the shortcut, and I'm going to put that in quotes because by no means is starting up a farm easy, but they're able to learn immediately from the experience of farmers who have tried and tested different practices and grown to learn what works.
I just spent a week on an island that is ostensibly powered by solar. It has no
Mm,
electrical power and few generators, but mostly solar. And one of the things that I know that your group is really quite intrigued with and pushing for is the idea that farms and the land that they occupy just offer this really pretty instant idea of solution of generating solar, and basically serving even surrounding communities with that. I mean, how do you make that happen all that readily
mm.
without there being a monstrous amount of infrastructural expenditure?
Right. That's a good question, Kirk. Maybe I'll just start with kind of a bit of context to answer that question. Currently, it's about 4% of farms that are generating renewable energy.
Mm,
That's relatively new for farms in Canada, but farmers have a long history of generating energy. As in, if you drive through Alberta, most farms will have oil rigs on their land. So farmers in many places are used to generating a revenue off of energy generation on their land. One of the things we think is quite possible and quite likely within Canada's green recovery from the pandemic is massive investments in clean energy infrastructure, manufacturing, and what and that's because it's a great opportunity for new job creation and economic regrowth after the pandemic. And what we're advocating for is incentives that would support farmers to then be able to purchase quickly that kind of infrastructure that they can then put on their land and benefit from.
mhm,
There are some farmers actually who are using, let's just take solar as an example, they're using their solar panels to actually plug in their electric tractors.
mhm.
And there's not many electric tractors yet in Canada, Kirk. But one of the other things that we're pushing for is actually a kind of a critical competitive advantage we have in Canada. We're actually really well placed to be producing big batteries, big electric batteries,
Mhm.
for things like school buses and public transit, big trucks. And we think that there could be a great overlap with farm machinery, so off-road vehicles like tractors, these kinds of things that farmers rely on. If we're making a clean energy transition across our economy, agriculture can't be left out, and neither can farm machinery. And so there's a great opportunity potentially right now to invest in, Canadian manufacturing of on farm of farm machinery like tractors, so that then farmers can be well placed in the future to buy made in Canada tractors that are electric.
But let
Uh,
me jump in
yeah,
a
go
little
ahead.
bit on this one,
Hmm.
because I know, I mean, I'm sure you've been hearing in the last week or so, uh, almost like a new sound that's coming out of the federal government, that it really wants the recovery to be very much a green recovery in this country. It doesn't appear to have the same weight, the same emphasis on, say, some of the resource sector as it might have pre-pandemic. So,
Hmm.
so essentially, what's the opportunity, do you think, here for agriculture?
Right. It's a great question. I mean, I'll start with three things perhaps that are important to remember in terms of farming. So the first one is, farmers are on the front lines of climate change. So more and more they're impacted, losing harvests because of massive hailstorms in June in southern Alberta, or too much rain in BC. That's point one. Point two, though, is that emissions in the ag sector are actually increasing over the next decade. So that means between now and the Paris Agreement, emissions in the sector are really going in the wrong direction. And the third point is that farmers themselves can actually offer solutions that can benefit all Canadians towards getting closer to the climate targets we want to meet for Paris. So what we're thinking about here is that, the government focus on a green recovery from the pandemic offers a huge opportunity to invest in climate resilience in agriculture. For us, climate resilience is adapting to climate impacts needs to go hand in hand with reducing emissions. So I'll give you a good example. One of the things we're promoting is incentives that support farmers to adopt cover cropping. Cover cropping maybe is a complicated jargony word that we use in the farming community, but all it means is essentially planting a crop that either helps to sequester nitrogen in your soil, kind of improve your soil health so it has more nutrition to serve the plants when they're growing, the plants that you're going to harvest, and it keeps your soil covered. So that means, your soil isn't blowing away and it's building soil health, building carbon sequestration in the soil. And with incentives to scale up cover cropping, we know that not only can more carbon be sequestered in the soil, but farmers can use far less nitrogen fertilizer. Nitrogen fertilizer has a huge carbon footprint out of the heavy industry, out of the heavy industry sector. And it's that kind of incentive that then supports a farmer to not only reduce emissions on their land, but when we're encouraging practices that increase soil health, we're actually building resilience on the land too. So
Yeah.
soil health, it acts like a sponge. So if it rains too much, your soil drains well. If it doesn't rain enough, your soil keeps water, and your crops then are in better health throughout the season, and you'll end up seeing a stronger harvest. So for
So,
me, Kirk, that's like the win-win-win, environment wins, but so do farmers in terms of making a livelihood off the land.
when I hear an incentive like this, which sounds quite sensible, quite common sense, obviously nothing strikes me as being in the way of it, except one thing, which is that our neighbors to the south get quite perturbed when they perceive that anything that appears to be some kind of a subsidy of agriculture. They cry foul. They consider it an unfair trade advantage that we have, and that kind of thing. How do you know how you make sure that an incentive like this isn't perceived as some sort of prop for an industry that then runs afoul of the trade people?
Right. Good question. So market concerns, of course, for farmers, they're trying to make a livelihood off of what they're growing. And that's hard. That's hard to do. I think the simple answer to this question, Kirk, is just that this isn't actually a subsidy for the crop or the product that they're growing to sell at the market, but rather it's an incentive to encourage good behavior that doesn't directly influence that market. So it's essentially a payment to help them cover the cost and take on the risk of adding in a practice that will do some environmental good. Because that's the thing, is that farmers every year are making decisions, like any good business person, around how much they're spending and how much they're going to make. So when we're talking about something like cover cropping, well, there's an added expense there. It's added labor, it's added seeds, it's time to get it out of the field before you get it into into your real cropping system. All of those things cost money. And what we're hoping is that through this kind of incentive, it doesn't create any kind of trade distortion, but rather helps the farmer just cover their cost to add in a practice that's good, not just for the farmer and kind of the longevity, the sustainability of their business, but good for all Canadians because it reduces emissions.
Yeah. I want to pick up on something that we discussed a little bit earlier in the discussion here. So it has to do with, I think, just the succession planning of a farm and the fact that you're going to get a lot of people retiring. And we've seen this really now for a few generations where, fewer and fewer have decided that this is going to be their lives' pursuit, and all this. How do you turn a little bit of that around, Karen, so that first of all, that it's going to attract, and not just those that have an awareness and a concern about climate change, but those that frankly just see it as a logical, sensible business to run, where it's not, we're not simply trying to point young people toward tech jobs in the city, for instance.
Yeah, good question, and it's a hard one. I
It's a
think what
culture.
would
It's a
be
cultural thing, isn't it? I mean,
it's a cultural thing, exactly. But I think we can all, as citizens of the world, we can all relate to the idea of having a really good mentor, having a leader who inspires us to do something. I think we need the kinds of farmers who are leading voices in Farmers for Climate Solutions to hold the spotlight a little more, to talk to high school children, to talk to elementary school children, to make it an available career choice that isn't just kind of hard, laborious work in which you're fighting the weather and making small margins.
Mm.
There is, though, Kirk, a severe problem in agriculture. Farm debt has doubled over the past decade, to which is now, $115 billion. That's huge. So, most young people or new people who are seeking a career don't have the capital to invest in the kind of machinery and land necessary. So another key thing we're thinking about is ways in which the government can help to reduce some of those barriers. So it's not just about knowledge and feeling inspired on how to farm, but it's also about reducing real capital barriers to entering the sector.
Yeah, I wonder about the political leadership at times in this
Mm.
country, because obviously 50 or 100 years ago, political leaders really understood the farm. They knew it. They had family likely that worked in it. It was not considered something that is a bit divorced in the way that it is today from urban life. And apart from individual MPs or members of a legislative assembly or something whose ridings are directly on agricultural land, I don't hear our national or even our provincial leaders talking much day to day about agriculture.
Mm.
How do you get them to do that?
That's a good question. Our new deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, well, our new finance minister, I guess I should say, her father's a rancher.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a small connection, but I think you're right that food is something we talk a lot about. And I think more than ever, it's been in the media in relation to the pandemic. We saw major stockpiling and empty shelves at the beginning, to then kind of more than ever people thinking about resilience in food and agriculture. So I think we may be at a moment here, Kirk, kind of at a pivot where we're going to see much more conversation about food and farming. What we know from our meetings with offices in Ottawa, we actually just had a meeting this morning with Minister Bibeau, the agriculture minister. And she is incredibly keen to position agriculture, food and farming as a key pillar in Canada's green recovery from COVID-19. And I heard loud and clear from her that climate resilience and reducing emissions, increasing adaptation needs to be part of that conversation. I also know that Minister Wilkinson's office is really interested in thinking about how all of Canada can reduce emissions. And as I mentioned earlier in this segment, agriculture emissions are increasing. So they're also acknowledging that something different needs to change. So I think at a decision-making level, I think the government too is realizing that agriculture can be front and center and can be part of the solution to climate change and our green recovery, a part of building back a better future in Canada. And then I think the other thing, Kirk, is just getting more farmers in the media, getting more farmers to talk about their experience on the land, getting
Right.
more Canadians kind of rallied behind their causes and their hard work. I think that'll help the conversation move forward.
And one last thing, I guess, Karen, has the pandemic, do you think, taught people about the supply chain, about the fact that we now have much more of a global interconnectedness than we have had, and that it's precarious at times, and that we need maybe to resolve that we're going to, frankly, bring things back home a little bit more for the sake of protection, because we know that we'll have another pandemic at some stage.
Yeah, Yeah, Kirk, I think you'd be living under a rock in Canada if you didn't see any of the media or be part of conversations in which, people were turning to backyard gardening and balcony gardening and supporting actively farmers markets as an essential service and thinking deeply about where their food came from, particularly at the outset of the pandemic when we saw massive stockpiling and empty shelves. I think the fact that our food crosses many borders, that even the laborers who produce a lot of our food in Canada also, they too cross many borders. I think for Canadians, it's really woken us up to some of the vulnerabilities and some of the lack of resilience in our food system, which
Mm.
of course includes farming, the production itself. So as I say, Kirk, I mean, maybe to conclude, I think we're really at a moment now where Canadians and the government are listening and thinking about strengthening local supply chains, thinking about regional and localized processing facilities. You'll remember the massive shutdowns in the meat packing plants, and that created massive supply chain issues for our beef industry in Canada. I think and that goes all the way to people actually getting engaged themselves in buying seeds, growing food, and knowing what it feels like to taste your tomato from the garden. So I think the pandemic has, I hate to call it an opportunity because it's been so stressful and damaging for most communities, and some communities have been more affected than others, but just to say that it certainly opened our eyes to the ways in which we may we do want to consider building back better and not just building back what was.
Yeah. It's been an illuminating conversation, Karen. I hope we can chat again to see how some of your advocacy might have an impact as we start to see a whole new wave of federal and provincial programs across this country. So thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Kirk, and we'll look forward to the speech from the throne, hoping to see farming and food in there for sure.
Right. Karen Ross is the head of Farmers for Climate Solutions. I'm Kirk LaPointe. Thanks a lot for watching us here on BIV Daily. We'll see you again.